Today we're going to be looking at the Tor Network. We're going to be looking at different, why is the Tor Network a thing, and how it works. So let's get started. Now I want to, before we get on to actually Tor's protocol, virtual private networks. So a VPN, when you visit a website, your IP address is visible to whatever web server you're contacting. They can see a log of incoming requests and what IP those requests are from. Now VPNs promise anonymity, but when you use a VPN, so the connection's made via the VPN provider's servers, and so the recipient doesn't actually see your IP address, they see the VPN's IP address. So for example, traditionally, if you just want to access a web server, and this is you and this is a web server, the web server will be able to see that a request has come from 1.2.3.4, so they can see your IP address. But a VPN is like this man-in-the-middle proxy sort of thing, where you pass the request to the VPN then uses its own sort of details to, or its own machine to send that to the web server, and the web server will see that as coming from the VPN's IP address. It won't actually have any knowledge of the original IP address that sent that request. And similarly, this then sends the data back to the VPN, and the VPN then sends it back to you. So at no point does the server is the server actually aware of you or your IP address. So that's what a VPN achieves. But the thing is, they aren't complete anonymity from all parties, right? So VPNs use encryption protocols. They use things like TLS, IPsec to protect data, but they also have access to the traffic to some extent. So you can imagine this as a man-in-the-middle attack. It looks very similar to a man-in-the-middle attack. And a VPN, because all of your traffic's being routed through the VPN can see what IP addresses you are contacting, and sometimes also see some metadata about requests that are being sent. If there's stuff that's being sent in plain text, the VPN can sort of snoop in on that. And they can also see what URLs you're requesting quite often. Even if not, they can sort of get an idea of what servers you're requesting from the IP addresses you're trying to contact. So to the VPN provider, there's not that anonymity there. Another concern is law enforcement might get in touch with the VPN. The VPN might then forward data onto law enforcement, which allows them to link these two. Obviously that's good if there's some sort of criminal activity going on, but if you're living in a country where it's hard to have freedom of speech or that sort of thing, that's a big concern, then this is still a point of failure, and if this is compromised, then the whole system might as well be compromised and this becomes redundant. Okay, so that brings us on to onion routing. Now, onion routing, the goal of onion routing is to bring a much higher level of anonymity to traffic that's going across the internet, and we do this by sending things through, or sending traffic through multiple proxies. So a VPN might just be A to VPN to B. This is just what the traffic might look like. With onion routing, you can see that this is us, and we want to send something to K, and we forward what we want to send through a bunch of different people until it gets to K. So the idea is we route our traffic through multiple proxies. Now, onion routing ensures that your message is securely encrypted in layers and routed through multiple nodes, and each node knows only the IP address of the previous and the next hop. So, for example, hit D only knows C's IP address and E's IP address. D knows nothing about these guys. D knows nothing about F onwards. D only knows the previous and the next proxy in the hop. And so this means that no single entity can trace the entire path. Okay, one sec. Okay, now the public key of every proxy in this chain of nodes is known. It's public knowledge to anyone. And the source IP is visible only to the entry node, and the destination IP is only visible to the exit node. So when I talk about entry node, I mean the first node in this chain. And when I talk about the exit node, it's the last node in the chain. Now, users pick, typically it's 3 proxies, but this can be configured or changed. But by default, it's 3 proxies. So users pick 3 proxies, an entry proxy, an exit proxy, and this middle proxy. And they can remain anonymous when they're trying to communicate with the server, as long as at least one of these nodes is not compromised. So the user sends something to N1, who will then forward it to N2, who will then forward it to N3, who will then forward it to the server, and then the response comes back in the same way across that Tor chain. Okay, so yeah, just an example of that. So we want to send something to node 1, then that gets sent to node 2, and then that gets sent to node 3. and then the server will see this as coming from N3. The server won't see this as coming from 1.2.3.4. And then the server will respond to N3 with whatever response they want to send back. That will then be sent back to N2, which will then be sent to N1, which will then be sent to the original requester. Does the client choose the nodes themselves? The client can choose their own nodes manually, but with most clients like the Tor browser, it will automatically pick nodes for you from like trusted lists or well-known lists. Obviously, that is another point of failure. Like, how do you know that you can trust the Tor browser or wherever you seeded or downloaded it from? But yeah, the user can choose the nodes themselves if they like trust a certain list of Tor nodes very well. Yeah. Okay. Now, onion routing. So exactly what we've looked at, but with the cool notation. Okay, so we'll get onto that, but this is why it's called onion routing. You can imagine it as sort of being wrapped in layers, like an onion. So when you send it to Tor node 1, this yellow layer is unwrapped. And then you send it to Tor node 2 and this blue layer is unwrapped, and you send it to Tor node 3 and this pink layer is unwrapped. So, this might look a bit overwhelming at first, but it's not that deep. Basically, say this is Alice. Let's make it Alice, and they want to send something to this server. Now, Alice wants to send it through all of these nodes. Now, if Alice sends something to Tor node 1 in plain text, and then that's sent to Tor node 2, and then that's sent to Tor node 3, and then that's sent to the server, if all of these are just in plain text, then that's no good because anyone can read that traffic. Then you've got zero security. It's all out in the open. So we want to use some sort of encryption. So Alice wants to encrypt. Actually, let me do this. Okay, so Alice wants to make sure that only Tor node 1 can read the thing that she's sending out. So let's wrap the message that Alice wants to send in that Tor node 1. So this circle essentially means we've encrypted the message with the public key of this Tor node 1. Because remember, all of these public keys are public knowledge, so only this node will be able to take off this layer. But then we have the issue of when Tor node 1 wants to then send that to Tor node 2, obviously it can't send it like this because Tor node 2 can't understand what's in this yellow, what's encrypted with Tor node 1's public key. So Tor node 1 has to take off this shell and send it to Tor node 2. But then there's the problem of anyone can intercept that exchange. If this is just plain text, anyone can intercept that. So what we want to do is we want to wrap whatever's in here, we want to wrap this message with Tor node 2's public key. So we want to encrypt it with that public key as well. So then Tor node 1 gets the message, unwraps it, and forwards this to Tor node 2, unwraps it, and then forwards this to Tor node 3. But again, here, we have that issue. If the message is sent in plain text, anyone knows it. Anyone who wants to look at that message knows it. So we wrap it in another layer. So we wrap it in another layer inside of that, this pink layer, which is Tor node 3's public key. So by wrapping it in all of these, or by encrypting it with all of these public keys, it means it can't get intercepted by someone else who's just listening in. And so when Alice then sends that message, Alice will send it to Tor node 1. Tor node 1 will unwrap it or decrypt it and send it to Tor node 2, who will then decrypt it, who will then send it to Tor node 3, who will then decrypt it, who will then send the message to the server. And the server can handle this request, generate a response, and the inverse will take place. But one thing I do want to also mention is, obviously, this is the entry node, this is the exit node. The entry node and the exit node, as we saw on a previous slide, those two, if they're compromised, then you've got big issues, right? Because like if the entry node's compromised, yes, they don't know who you're trying to communicate with. They don't know that this is who you're trying to communicate with, but they know who you are. So they know your IP address is trying to use the Tor network. And obviously, if this exit node's compromised, then they might not know who you are, but they might be able to get some sort of information from this message you're trying to send to the server, and they also know who you're trying to contact. So if these two are compromised, then they have direct access to the sender or the recipient's identity. Obviously, if this middle one's accessed, that's also an issue, because then they know the previous and next nodes, but they don't know the intended recipient or the original sender. So these two are like the riskiest ones to get compromised, and the more nodes you have in the chain, the less risky it is that your chain will be compromised. Okay, moving on. So this is just the notation of the diagram that I just showed you guys. So if we remember Diffie-Hellman, we choose a secret, and the other party chooses a secret, and then our key we get from GXY. And we just broadcast these as our public keys. Our secrets are just X and Y. So only the two parties involved in the communication can derive this key by raising the other person's public key to the power of their private key. I'm not going to go into that in too much detail because I think it's been covered in like 4 sessions now. But what this diagram's showing is Alice will encrypt G to the X. This is just so this whole process up here, up until this point, is just agreeing on the keys. So Alice will send G of X to Tor node 1. Tor node 1 will send G of Y and a hash of G of XY, which is basically the shared key Alice has with 1. So Alice and 1 share GXY. And then Alice will then create T2, which is Tor node 2's identity, and encrypt with Tor node 2's public key GZ. So this will be sent to node 1, and the reason we encrypt this with Tor node 2's public key is because we don't want Tor node 1 to be able to read G to the power of Z, right? So we send this to Tor node 1, encrypted with GXY, so only Tor node 1 can read it. And Tor node 1 looks at this first argument and says, hey, okay, Alice wants me to forward this on to Tor node 2. So Tor node 1 will forward it to Tor node 2. Tor node 2 will then generate their own Diffie-Hellman secret, their own Diffie-Hellman public key, and a hash of the shared key, and send that back, which Tor node 1 will then wrap up and send back to Alice. So now Alice has a key with Tor node 1 and a key with Tor node 2, which is G of ZW. And then again, the same thing happens. We want to talk to T3, but here we encrypt it with GZW. So even when Tor node 1 gets this message, all they have to do is just forward it onto Tor node 2. So they forward it to Tor node 2. Tor node 2 unwraps it and says, okay, we need to send this to T3. T3 gets Alice's third secret, generates their own private public key Diffie-Hellman pair, and sends that back, wrapped up, and Alice now has a key with Tor node 3, which is G of... okay, that should be ZW, and it should be G of UV. So the idea is, Alice has these pairs with every single Tor node in the chain. And so then when Alice wants to actually send something to the server, encrypt it with Tor node 1 as the outermost layer. Yeah, let me use those colors. Okay, so we encrypt it with Tor node 1, and then the second layer we encrypt with Tor node 2, the shared key, and then the third layer we encrypt with Tor node 3 shared key. And then we send the message. Tor node 3 will send the message to the server, and the response is sent back to Tor node 3, which they encrypt with UV, because only Alice has UV. So that means Tor node 2 and 1 can't read that request, or that response. We then wrap that up in ZW, which again only Alice can read, and then we wrap that up in XY. So then Alice just has to decrypt this, decrypt this, decrypt this, because she has these 3 keys, and then she can see the response that the server sent back. Before I continue, that was a lot, so is there any questions about the protocol or any of the steps here? Like, all that's actually happening here is it's just 3 key agreements with 3 different Tor nodes using Diffie-Hellman that are all nested in one another. Okay, so we've looked at how we can securely or sort of anonymously to an extent send something to the server by routing it through multiple proxies. But what if the server wants anonymity? What if the server doesn't want to make their IP address known to clients? So this is where Tor hidden services arise and are useful. So hidden services allow servers to hide their identity from clients. A server might have many reasons why they want to hide their identity that aren't just because they're hosting like an illegal marketplace. For example, if they're sharing information, that could lead to them being targeted by like corporations or, I don't know, some malicious person who wants to silence someone. there's a lot of reasons why you might want to host a hidden service. So how it works is we have this initial setup. So Alice wants to talk to Bob. Bob doesn't want Alice to know who he is, and Alice doesn't want Bob to know who she is. They both want to keep their identities completely separate and completely anonymous from one another. So to achieve this, we have four nodes here. They're called introduction points. There's 3 introduction points, and then we have 1 rendezvous point. We'll look at what all of these mean and why they exist. And all of these 4 nodes are on the actual Tor network. These are like Tor devices in the cloud. And all that means is they're running like Tor software, like protocol software. And then we have a database. This database is arguably a point of failure. We'll get onto that. But it's what basically stores information about who to contact or how to get to the server that you're trying to communicate with. Okay, so step 1, Bob, so our server, picks some introduction points and builds circuits to them. Now, these circuits, these arrows, aren't just direct connections of I know IP1's IP address or I know Bob's IP address. They're like hops of 3 Tor nodes. So each of these circuits is like 3 Tor nodes of communication. These are the whole hops that we saw above. So Bob establishes these introduction points, or Bob picks some introduction points and establishes these circuit connections, these circuit Tor connections with each of them. And then Bob advertises his service. So say he has xyz.onion. This is derived from his private key. This is like the public key equivalent of a Tor domain. Bob advertises this service on some publicly known trusted database, like xyz.onion. And note, Bob doesn't put his IP address here. Bob puts the 3 introduction points that someone else can contact or someone else can communicate with in order to communicate with Bob. So Bob puts the domain, the introduction points, and this public key. Can anyone tell me in chat, why does Bob need to put his public key here as well? Good, yeah. To encrypt for... Yeah, perfect, good. So, yeah, the reason Bob puts his public key here is so Alice can encrypt the message with Bob's public key, and so none of these IPs or the rendezvous point can snoop on the message, because we need a way to send something to Bob without anyone else reading it. And so the public key, while it doesn't give away his IP address, is a way for us to send stuff to Bob knowing only he can read it. It's like a one-way postbox for that asymmetric communication. Okay, so yeah, so we put this onto the database. So now Alice, for example, can read to the database and see what this onion site's introduction points are. Okay, so Alice hears that this xyz.onion site exists, and so she requests that information from the database, as we said, and she also establishes another Tor circuit, another connection with the rendezvous point. So this is not an introduction point, this is a rendezvous point, and this Alice sets up this connection with a rendezvous point, which are like publicly known. But note that the RP isn't part of the database, like Alice chooses this rendezvous point herself. From there, Alice then writes a message to Bob. So if this is the message that she's writing, and she encrypts it with Bob's public key, so obviously only Bob can decrypt it. She also has this rendezvous point, and she has this secret. This secret is just something only her and Bob should share. Obviously, all of this is wrapped up in Bob's... So the reason I put this blue box is because it's encrypted with Bob's public key. So only Bob can unwrap this. So Alice sends this to one of the introduction points that she saw in the database. So here she sent it to IP1. And she asks an IP to deliver it to Bob. The IP, the introduction point, will then forward that onto Bob using this circuit that they've established previously. And then Bob creates a response. And so Bob decrypts this and looks at the rendezvous point that Alice supplied, and Bob will establish a connection with that rendezvous point. So Alice has this connection with the rendezvous point, and now Bob also has this connection with that rendezvous point. So this is like the middleman of their communication, in a sense. Now, Bob also sends this secret when he establishes the connection with the rendezvous point, and this basically proves to Alice that Bob is the one connecting here, because no one else knows the secret. No one else can figure out this secret because it was encrypted with Bob's public key. So Bob now has this message, the rendezvous point, and the secret, and they both have this connection to this rendezvous point. From there, Bob and Alice just use this rendezvous point to communicate. So at this point, these introduction points are no longer needed because Alice and Bob have been introduced to each other. So now they can just communicate through this rendezvous point. Yeah, that's Tor hidden services. Are there any questions about any of the steps that I've just covered there? So to overview what we've covered, Tor, the idea of Tor, it provides these protocols that provide strong anonymity by routing the traffic through multiple nodes. It hides your IP and makes tracking difficult. Note that it doesn't make it impossible or unbreakable. If a government agency has access to the entry point and the exit point, they can like cross-correlate the actions and they can de-anonymize you even if you're using Tor. Government agencies are infamous for compromising Tor nodes and just like maliciously snooping on data, compromising privacy. So yeah, Tor hidden services also allow servers or like websites to stay anonymous, not just the clients. But obviously there is that incentive for governments and adversaries to always try and de-anonymize users. So the best thing to do is to try and increase the number of hops that you're taking. That would lead to increased waiting times because you're doing a lot more encryptions, you're waiting for traffic to travel across a bunch of different nodes. So it's security at the cost of convenience. But it's up to you whether or not you're willing to take that sacrifice. That's everything I want to cover on Tor. If there's any questions, drop them in the chat or in the comments. Like, sub, hit the bell. See ya. I'll stop the recording. See you guys.